and review later on. We have a lineup of really interesting and experienced speakers this morning who will bring USAID headquarters, mission, and implementing partner perspective on the topic of political economy analysis and thinking and working politically, 10 years of USAID experience, learning from that experience. So my name is Lisa McGregor. I'm the Director of Governance for RTI International, and I'm based in the Washington, D.C. area. Definitely working to train and support our project teams and home office facilitators with PEA and encouraging the move toward thinking and working politically is definitely a highlight for me. And I am honored to serve today as the facilitator for today's discussion. So just so we're on the same page, I wanted to provide some informal definitions of what is PEA and what is thinking and working politically. And certainly thinking and working politically definition is a work in progress, but just wanted to make sure that we all know on the same page. So applied PEA is a tool that helps teams to look under the surface. What's going on related to a development challenge? Or on the other hand, a development opportunity. You gather insights through discussions with key players. What are incentives that will enable or potentially block change? And most importantly, what are some realistic, practical solutions to the information that comes back from those discussions? It certainly can be done on a national, regional, sector, subsector level, but most implementers have found that issue-specific PEAs are most helpful. Certainly, national sector and subsector PEAs may be more relevant for USAID, for the country development strategy and program planning. So that's just sort of the differentiation in applied PEA. Now, thinking and working politically is the process of incorporating sort of a PEA lens and questioning and perspectives into implementation and the way a team operates. So it could take the place of regular PEA challenges incorporated into staff meetings and discussions, or into the MEL process, a pause and reflect session focused on those challenges or opportunities that a team is seeing. In the case of USAID, it probably involves more mission staff identifying and discussing development and implementation challenges, and then adapting their design, their plans in response to that information. So just to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to talk about today, a few logistical points. So today's speaker are going to provoke a lot of questions, we're sure, and we will leave time in each of our sessions for Q&A from the audience. So the way it'll work is I'll ask a few questions to each speaker, and then we'll open it up for your Q&A. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see two tabs, one marked Q&A. So please put your questions into that tab. There is the chat tab right next to it, and you can certainly comment on any point that the speakers bring up and our discussion today. But if you have questions, be sure to use the Q&A tab, because we'll be tracking that carefully and then bring the questions to each of the speakers. So today's event is brought to you by the Washington, D.C. Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, and supported in collaboration with the UK base. It's a global thinking and working politically community of practice. It's the most recent event in a series sponsored by the Global Practice. And in the chat channel, you'll see a link to upcoming events that are being sponsored and organized by the community of practice. And then Catherine will also put in a link to their newsletter, so you can sign up for that and stay informed. So we welcome Alina Roroka-Menakal this morning and Catherine Heliup from the Global Community of Practice. We're so happy that they could join us. Alina is a PEA and thinking and working politically expert and senior technical advisor for ODI. Catherine is program and communication manager for the community of practice, and definitely made today possible technically and logistically. So we thank both of them for their support and encouragement of this event. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Mark Cassidy, Managing Director of Adapt Consult, and Derek Brinkerhoff, Distinguished Fellow from RTI International. Both of them helped design and organize today's event and are committed members of the DC community of practice. So let me give you a quick overview of the session today, and then I'll introduce each speaker in a little bit more detail as we go through the agenda. So first, we're going to get the DC perspective, sort of the historical overview from a very experienced USAID staff member and senior leader. And then we're going to move to the mission perspective. What's been the learning at the mission level from teams inside missions, particularly in Asia. Third, we're going to have a small panel of implementers to get their perspective on implementing PEA and TWP inside USAID programming. And then we'll wrap up the speakers with a perspective on the policy and future direction for PEA and TWP at USAID. And then Alina Ropka-Menokal will give us some sort of key takeaways as she listens to the discussion and based on her experience. So that's the agenda overall. Let me start with the first speaker. Our first speaker is Laura Pavlovich. She's the Deputy Director of USAID's Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Center, also known as DRG Center. And she's based in Washington, D.C. Laura was a leader in USAID's effort to design, test, and expand agency's approach to PEA, and is now encouraging TWP at USAID and incorporating it throughout the agency. So let me start there with Laura. Welcome, Laura. Good to see you. So tell us, in your time, that historical perspective on PEA and thinking and working politically, what are some of the outcomes, the key outcomes at USAID that you've observed during that time?
Thanks so much, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. I am so excited for today's session. As Lisa's mentioned, I've been involved with the use of political economy analysis and the design of USAID's tool from the very beginning. And so I've just returned to Washington after 6 years in the field. So it's been great to re-engage with my colleagues who've really been spearheading this agenda and really get an update in terms of where we are. First and foremost, I think it's really important to distinguish between the uptake we've seen in the increased use of political economy analysis and the integration of more politically informed approaches to programming, which I think we can all agree is more nascent in our practice at USAID and can also be a lot more difficult to identify and evaluate. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But over the past 8 years since we've had the tool, we've amassed a number of case studies that have demonstrated the impact of political economy analyses on programming, but perhaps even more importantly on the nature of partnerships that missions have built with local actors, with other donors, with partner country governments, and with colleagues across regions and across the agency. But first, with respect to designs, I think we've seen a number of different types of impacts emerging. Case studies have indicated the importance of the use of PEA to unlocking a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the political dynamics that circumscribe the space available for development assistance interventions, which has really shaped the way that missions have prioritized programmatic approaches. For example, our mission in Kosovo conducted a country-level analysis that helped to formalize and systematize their understanding of Kosovo's political economy. It really served as a reality check for that mission to help the mission identify the types of programming that were politically feasible. In Honduras, a more politically informed understanding of the nature of corruption guided the mission to refine its approach in understanding and managing corruption across sectors. We've also seen from the case studies the important role that PEAs can play, and as colleagues have characterized it, unlocking the black box of political will through a deeper understanding of the incentives that drive the actions of groups and individuals. In Ukraine, a PEA conducted during implementation of an agricultural development activity illuminated the lack of government interest in pursuing key reforms, but also the leverage and interest of the private sector in advocating reform. Over the course of several PEAs I engaged with in Serbia, we gained an ever more fine-grained understanding of the issues and movements that were able to gain traction with citizens in an increasingly stagnant reform environment. And this is an area where I can directly speak to some impacts. In the case of our civil society programming, this led us to focus our support more and more on community level issues, such as the defense of areas under environmental protection, where citizens were still engaged, rather than on the European Union integration efforts that, while they were geostrategically important, were not going to resonate with an increasingly apathetic and cynical public. Our partners that we engaged were able to harness this community engagement to turn the tide and demonstrate the power of citizen engagement. And over the 2 years that we were engaged in this, our surveys showed a tripling in the number of survey respondents reporting that they had engaged in civic initiatives. This was really coming out of political economy analysis that illuminated the way, but also the ways in which it shifted our relationships with local partners to take forward these. We've also seen a number of examples of missions that have embraced PEAs as an important tool to gain a deeper understanding of the challenges that they seek to address across a variety of sectors. An outbrief with the mission can often encourage colleagues in other sectors to consider PEA as a way of better understanding their context and challenges. And this is also moved beyond missions as well. In Ethiopia, the mission convened a session to discuss PEA findings with other leading donors struggling with similar challenges, which created a foundation for closer collaboration in the conduct of political economy analyses going forward. And in Niger and Senegal, PEAs were shared with partner country governments, which enabled a more informed joint approach to addressing key development challenges. To me, though, the most important impacts that we've seen from the increased use of PEAs has been the nudge that it's provided to many of us to shift the ways in which we program and engage. For myself, and I think for others involved in the PEA process, our experience and engagement in the analysis really has accelerated an integration of TWP into our programming and processes. For many of us who've been involved in these early PEAs, their findings really grounded us in the deep historical and socio-political reasons why the challenges we were trying to address persist. This has led us to pretty radically rescope and descope, in a lot of cases, our theories of change and the role that we as donors play in those theories of change. They've enabled us to identify and ideally directly engage with those local actors with the incentives and hopefully the opportunities to positively impact these challenges, and to support them in developing the networks they need to actually effectuate change. Finally, these PEAs imbued us with a far deeper understanding of the institutional and political inertia that underlies the complexity of the challenges that we are seeking to address, and the importance of building in space to learn as you go and doing whatever you can to help in facilitating the change you'd like to support. These ways of working politically are still a little new, but although I do think that for a variety of reasons, they're becoming more common, as we'll come back to later.
Really great overview and some great results in some of the PEAs that the missions have been implementing. I love the phrase "unlocking the black box of political will." Yeah, it's really a great perspective from the USAID side. So tell us, over the last decade that you've been involved and that USAID has been really focused on trying to embed this into the agency, what's been the uptake of TWP and PEA, especially across sectors?
It's a great question, Lisa, and it's certainly something that I've been reflecting on a lot, having been back for the past year. And I have to say, you know, kind of coming back to Washington after a number of years serving in missions abroad, I've really been excited to see the number of PEAs that have been carried out across a variety of sectors, as well as a number of missions that have embraced PEAs as an important tool to gain a deeper understanding of the challenges that they seek to address. I have to say, this progress has been driven in huge part due to the massive efforts taken by my colleagues in the DRG Center that I worked with directly in the beginning, who trained hundreds of officers across aid and PEA and TWP over the years, and have supported missions globally in conducting political economy analyses and integrating their findings into project designs. This work, I think it's important to note, has been part of a decade-long effort to advance the integration of DRG principles and practices across USAID's development portfolio, which has really included extensive engagement with other sectors to socialize the impact of politics on the available space for change. And I think really PEA and TWP have been probably the greatest and most lasting impacts that we've had since the last DRG strategy that really elevated the issue of DRG integration. The impact of this engagement and this cross-learning is really clear in USAID's forestry and biodiversity sector, which has a long tradition of considering politics and power and has embraced the use of PEA and TWP, as well as in our market systems and agricultural policy sectors, where we've seen quite intentional efforts to better mainstream PEA and TWP. But I think there remains a lot of work to be done to translate our analysis into action and thinking into working politically. Thanks to the work of colleagues within both USAID and our implementer community, we do have a recent qualitative analysis of the uptake of PEA among USAID contractors. And over the past couple of years surveyed, PEAs have appeared in USAID requests for proposals across a range of sectors, but they remain much more common in the democracy, rights and governance and environmental and natural resource management sectors, both sectors that, as I've mentioned, have traditionally focused much more explicitly on politics. Moreover, we've seen PEAs much more common in solicitations originating in the Latin America and Caribbean and Asia regions, which are both regions where a number of USAID missions have embraced the use of PEAs as part of their operations. So it's important to underscore that this analysis only considers PEAs commissioned as part of the solicitation process, so doesn't capture the PEAs that missions or USAID assistance providers are conducting, nor does it consider how the findings of PEAs conducted have been operationalized. But I think while we can say, I think we can all agree that uptake may be somewhat mixed, I think that there are a number of enabling factors in place for those of us that believe in the power of these approaches should really consider. On the one hand, we've seen an evolution in programming approaches in a number of key sectors away from a technical focus on institutions toward a greater focus on the incentives that drive the behaviors of both key actors and groups within these institutions. In a lot of cases, these shifts have occurred independently of the use of PEA. This provides new opportunities to engage other development sectors in considering how politics impacts the challenges that they want to address, and how the integration of PEA and TWP approaches can assist in better understanding and addressing these issues. This is an approach we're currently pursuing in the climate space at USAID, where we see responsive governance and citizen participation and effective and accountable climate action is really interdependent and mutually reinforcing. And where we think a deeper understanding of politics, incentives, and entry points is essential to efforts to elevate and effectively advance climate action. At the same time, we do need to do more to demonstrate the impact of politically aware programming. While the DRG Center and others have funded a number of case studies over the years, we haven't yet invested in rigorous evaluations of TWP programming to quantify or make the case for these approaches to sectoral colleagues who may have less flexibility or familiarity to take on more politically aware approaches. And finally, we need to incentivize missions and sectors to build in space for working politically. As I'll mention in a few minutes, USAID's embrace of adaptive management provides an ideal platform to build in space for regular reflection and adaptation that are so core to the soul of TWP. But it's a lot more difficult to track the uptake of these approaches, certainly from here in Washington. Our PPL colleagues' CLA case study competitions provide a really compelling model for a platform that both rewards, convenes, and identifies emerging practice that I think all of us interested in the uptake and scaling of TWP approaches should consider.
Thanks, Laura. I have a follow-up question. So you mentioned LAC, Asia, biodiversity, and DRG were the areas where you've seen more uptake in USAID. Why do you think that is? What's driving that in those areas?
You know, certainly in those sectors, certainly when it comes to, kind of environments, biodiversity work, there has long been an appreciation of the ways in which, kind of politics and power impact development challenges. So I think, and certainly when you look at, kind of policy reform work, certainly I'm very well aware of the fact that I'm sharing this space with Derek Brinkerhoff, who really was in the vanguard of, kind of advancing our thinking on implementing policy change. I think that really has imbued these sectors with a much finer grained understanding of the politics and the political ways in which, kind of change actually happens and is sustained. So I think that there are sectors within USAID that have a leg up in terms of these ways of thinking.
Okay, great. What about constraints? What are some of the constraints within the agency that you've talked a lot about the things that enable it? What are some of the constraints inside the agency to furthering this practice?
I think that there are a couple of big ones. Certainly, the money is a big constraint. I think the unpredictability of funding cycles and highly earmarked and directed budgets and sectoral funding really continue to hamper the sort of long-term and more flexible implementation models that are so critical to effective TWP. We have seen really interesting new models of longer-term iterative approaches that I think we need to keep an eye on because they make space for these, these more politically informed and flexible approaches to development, such as the Global Fragility Act or the Partnerships for Democratic Development program that was launched last year as part of the Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal. For the most part, though, missions, it's difficult to make those, 5-10-year engagements that you really need to do to really understand more deeply the politics that underscore these development challenges, test potential approaches, build those relationships with stakeholders, test, reflect, adapt, and scale that really is so important to a TWP approach. So I think that's one issue. The other issue that I really think is a huge constraint, and it's certainly something that we see, looking at some of the missions that have been engaged for longer in this, is that mining the politics, whether that's through the conduct of political economy analysis or through regular political reflection and iteration, is a really time-consuming exercise. And to be able to really ensure continued awareness and fluency with this, which is really critical, not just for learning, but for really, kind of operationalizing these approaches, we need to do more to invest in local staff, both within missions and in implementing partners they already have the deepest understanding of political context. They're best placed to ensure that programs, strategy, and engagement is attuned to realities on the ground. I think without having that continuity of approach and those processes built in, these approaches are very unlikely to sustain.
Yeah, great point, Laura, about local staff. That's been our experience, and we'll hear from a couple of implementers in a minute that really pulling out those the feedback from the staff and having them implement the PEA has been much more effective in getting deeper insights. So really great point. There's a couple of questions. One is asking what role PEA and TWP has played in the energy sector. Given the climate change strategy on system change, it would appear that PEA should play an increasing role in energy sector programming.
It is a great question. And as I mentioned, we really, my colleagues, including Sarah Swift, who you'll be hearing from later, have really been in the vanguard of, kind of engaging. And we've found, really fantastic collaboration with our climate colleagues in this space. They too have come to the table very well aware of the fact that, kind of politics, the state of relationships, the importance of, kind of inclusive and accountable governance is absolutely core to this. I think that this is a huge opportunity for us to be working much more concertedly to build a deeper understanding of the politics of energy transitions, right? This has a very direct impact on communities. And I think those, those programs are ideally suited to the integration of PEA and TWP approaches. It's something that we are, kind of actively engaging our climate colleagues in building out as part of the implementation of USAID's new climate strategy. Lisa, you're muted.
Thank you. There's another really interesting question in the Q&A chat. So this person's wondering if there's been any experience of using thinking and working politically on the global stage as USAID engages with global leadership to influence the way key partners advance and invest and share development agendas.
That is a really interesting question. I personally, I would defer to my colleagues who have been, kind of tracking this through, kind of throughout the past 10 years. I definitely think that, there are, emerging platforms that I think provide an opportunity to take these sorts of approaches. Those, kind of that work more directly with USAID will be aware of our administrators' focus on, progress beyond programs, which really is looking at, kind of how we can crowd in, a variety of approaches to support our local partners in advancing, kind of action to address some of the development challenges they face, right? Getting beyond programming, thinking about, kind of how we can be facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogue to take on, kind of development challenges, how we can be engaging, kind of other donors, private sector, foundations, in, kind of building more, kind of collective approaches to addressing some of these development challenges. That approach, I think, provides an outstanding platform for, kind of building in a greater awareness of the of politics and thinking about, kind of how we can be engaging in a way that is much more responsive to shifts in local context. And so it's certainly something that as we build up our, kind of approach to take forward this initiative, we are starting actually with, kind of thinking about how we can be engaging missions to build that, kind of local political contextual knowledge that's going to be really important to advancing these, kind of more complex approaches moving forward.
So speaking of complexity, I have one last question for you that's coming from Claire Gowan and Tom Bridle. What about the intersection between PEA and the new guidance on anti-corruption?
So as I was talking about, really important sectoral shifts that we've seen, I think, I really, what I had underneath the surface, I think the two best examples that we've seen certainly in the DRG space over the past couple of years have been the anti-corruption space and also the rule of law space, which has really embraced this, kind of approach to people-centered justice. I think that, kind of, and you see this coming through really, really clearly in USAID's new anti-corruption policy, an embrace of, kind of building in a deeper understanding of this, of the systems that, kind of drive corruption on the ground, but also, are key to, kind of effectively addressing corruption challenges. So I think that policy, USAID's forthcoming rule of law policy really put this, kind of focus on, individual group incentives beyond institutions, really put that at the forefront, and I think provide a really exciting set of new opportunities to take forward these sorts of approaches.
Laura, thanks so much for your perspective, long-term perspective. We're going to move on to the next speaker, but thank you very much, and we'll maybe circle back at the end of the session. So our second speaker is Jerry Porta. He's Senior Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Specialist in the USAID Philippines and Pacific Mission. He's going to share with us some mission level perspectives on the impact, opportunities, and challenges related to PEA and TWP in the mission that he operates, and also from some of his colleagues as well. So welcome, Jerry. Thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over to you. The first question we wanted to get your perspective on was, what have you seen as the short and long-term effects of conducting PEAs across the mission?
Thank you, Lisa, and greetings from Manila, everyone. I do realize that I'm preaching to the choir. So for this first question, long-term, short-term impacts of conducting PEAs, let me try to keep my answer in a concise manner. In the short term, PEAs allow us a deeper understanding of contextual realities. We're able to carefully consider political dynamics and factor them in our planning. It informs our interventions and enables us to be tactical, to be effectively tactical. For example, I am sure everybody appreciates this. We're able to identify reform champions, as well as those who oppose reforms, and through this process, identify the best courses of action to successfully navigate our unique political environments. Let me just cite a very specific example. 2022 is an election year in the Philippines, and we were basically expecting a turnover would happen in terms of the leadership of local governments that USAID was working in, particularly key cities in the Philippines. And so basically, I sat down with our contractor to look at each particular city and basically do a rapid political economy analysis of who's the incumbent, who's running against him, who are they connected with, what are their interests, what motivates them, and basically plan for all contingencies, regardless of whether A1, B1, C1, D1. We had a plan. the result of which, after the elections, we again sat down, we looked at our analysis and said, okay, this is how we proceed. And the net result of that is that even with the political transition that took place a few months ago, our program continues seamlessly, even with new leadership in place, by working with the local champions, local reform champions, particularly civil service people who work for elected officials, etc. So certainly very helps us become more effective in the short term. In the long term, I would summarize it into more effective implementation and overall sustainability. PEAs help us facilitate and broker partnerships or collaborations based on long-term engagements. It helps us achieve policy reforms, and equally important, get them implemented. To me, the alliances that you build when you think and work politically is key to not just passing policy, but also getting them fully implemented. And in the long run, helps ensure that the benefits of that particular intervention is sustained. I have many examples, but I'll reserve that for the question and answer portion later if it comes up, in the interest of brevity. Back to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Jerry. Really great. And I love the comment about implementing policies. I think we've all been involved in helping develop policies, and then they're taken on board and approved. But the trick is implementing them, right? And finding the best way and who's the champions to help you implement those policies.
It's probably even more challenging, I would dare say.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. So tell me about at the mission level, what are some of the opportunities, but also barriers about trying to implement PEA? And then more specifically, shift to thinking and working politically, that the leadership, office directors, and team members would hopefully start to take on this way of thinking and working inside the mission.
Okay, thank you for the question. Let me start with barriers. We had a small conversation about this during the briefing for this seminar. Many people, maybe because they have a very specific idea of what politics is, thinks politics is still perceived to be a bad thing, a bad word, not one that development agency should be involved in. I think this is partly because politics is equated to electoral politics. And even as an agency, USAID, we're not supposed to be engaging in partisan politics, etc. Although the definition of politics, engagement in the affairs of a particular country, basically establishes to me, it's neither negative or positive. So to me, that's a barrier. There are still notions that we should be staying away from political action, which is an essential to technical analysis, political economy analysis, followed by political action. I think Laura alluded to this earlier. There's the time element and the cost element. In an ideal world, we should be doing political economy analysis in all stages. But where do we insert an honest to goodness PEA? Is it at the level of developing our CDCS, our Country Development Cooperation Strategy? Is it at the level of designing projects, which in USAID is the umbrella structure under which specific activities belong? Or do we do PEA at the activity level? Ideally, we should be doing it in most of these stages, but can we afford it? Do we have the time to do it? Projects, when they're implemented, in an ideal world, when we get proposals, when we do RFAs, RFPs, I would say that ideally the proposals should be informed by political economy analysis, particularly in the DRG sector. Laura was saying in the environment sector, or in the economic growth sector, where there's a lot of work on economic policy reform. But normally what happens is the PEA is built into the project. And so what does that say of the proposal that you'll get? Essentially, the proposal says in month 3, in month 4, we'll do a PEA. and then we'll figure out what to do later on, right? So to me, there's a bit of a timing element there as well. There are still some who would argue that technical analysis suffices versus PEAs. And I would argue that it is not an either or proposition, but a combination of both TA and PEA that makes a project, an activity, so much more grounded in the operating environment, in the specific context that a particular host country presents. I think that in terms of barriers also, there's perhaps a capacity issue, and whether the buy-in is adequate or not, I would also question at this point. I think thinking politically, it's more or less rooted. Working politically needs more work. Opportunities. Using political economy analysis and thinking and working politically, I think is facilitated by the fact that it complements other USAID or agency priorities, such as localization. Supporting development entrepreneurs almost always means supporting local actors. And in that sense, it broadens our implementing partner ecosystem. It promotes localization of development, right? I think that another factor that facilitates the adoption of PEAs and TWPs is the growing appreciation for the importance of PEAs and TWP across technical sectors. We are compiling here at the mission in Manila, documenting experiences that basically prove PEAs and TWP are critical to the success of activities, especially in policy formulation and implementation. There's a great book that was published by the Asia Foundation with USAID support and USAID support. It is called Built on Dreams, Grounded in Reality. This is the book. It contains, Zoom is blurring the book. It contains a lot of fascinating documentation of USAID Philippines experience in economic policy reform. Both successes and failures. It talks about the role of development entrepreneurs. It talks about the importance of PEAs and TWP. So there's documentation happening. There's proof that there's at least empirical evidence that political economy analysis and TWP is effective. And finally, let me just say that the political economy of countries that we operate in put significant pressure on missions to do PEAs and apply TWP. The Philippines is an example of that. When 20% of the population control 80% of the economy, looking at the political economy and doing a political economy analysis is to me common sense. How can you proceed working in an environment where 70 to 80% of elected officials come from dynastic families with intertwined interests with the people who control the economy? How can you proceed with institutional reform without looking at without looking at the political economy and working politically? So to summarize that point, I think the conditions in our respective countries really do put the onus on us to be thinking and working politically. And I'll stop there.
Great points, Jerry. A couple things I wanted to comment. Excuse me. I wanted to comment on is this discussion about technical analysis versus PEA. And I'll never forget a wash engineer saying to me, you know, I've been like hitting my head against the wall for 10 years in my career about these kinds of issues. And this PEA framework has finally given him the tool to consider those issues. So I think staff see it all, you know, both at the USAID level, but the implementer level as well. So being able to think about these issues and start to address them with practical solutions, I think is really one great advantage. And I love your comment about it being just common sense. So there's a couple questions in the chat that I'll share with you in a minute, but I wanted to ask, what do you think is the trend at the mission level? Is it an upward trend in the uptake and use of PEA and TWP? Is it, tell us where it stands in terms of encouraging it within the agency.
Or within the mission in my case, right?
Yeah, right.
While I came across TWP as a terminology, as a term of art in our work, about a decade ago, the idea of conducting PEAs and applying TWP has been evolving in our work in the Philippines since the 1990s, as shocking as that may sound. When we started supporting coalitions of CSOs and reformers to work on policy reform in support of what was then the government's social reform agenda. It may not have been labeled as PEA and TWP, but certainly the seeds of those were clearly sown even in the 90s. That politics is not necessarily a bad word, that you need to do stakeholder analysis, detailed SWOTs, detailed opportunities and threats, that our partners needed to switch from placards to position papers, building allies, the strategy to counter opposition, the willingness to work with government reformers, a lot of these principles, and basically accepting incremental reform. Let me just, in terms of how it has been adopted, let me read just a very short quote from the evaluation of our civil society program, which was written in 1998. So it precedes the term TWP by more than a decade. Success in policy, so this is a part of the evaluation. Success in policy advocacy is greatly influenced by the proper timing of strategies and actions of coalition groups. Well-timed and opportune launching of strategic actions based on an astute reading of the confluence of factors and events characterize right timing. Some factors to consider are the policy environment, the formation of allies and support groups, the degree or intensity of opposition, and the availability of critical information, which includes political relevance and the trends and flavor of popular political relations amongst the power holders. That is a quote from a 1998 evaluation of a USAID program in the mid-90s. So again, going back to my original thesis, this has been evolving over time here in the mission. I think that at this point in time, and I go back to an earlier statement I made, thinking politically, I think already is rooted in our culture here in the mission. Working politically needs a little bit more reinforcement at this stage.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. Great perspective. Just curious, how many of your colleagues, I'm not sure how big is the mission, how many staff roughly are there, and what percentage of the technical staff that are involved in program implementation really buy into PEA and thinking and working politically? I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but it would be interesting to know what percentage you think.
I probably won't be able to give you the exact numbers. There's 140 people or so in the mission. There are 5 technical offices: economic growth, DRG, environment, education, and health. Mm-hmm. I can in preparation for this seminar, for this conversation, I touched base with colleagues in the environment field, in the health field, in the economic growth field. All of us are implementing PEAs and implementing the TWP in some shape or form. I was just not able to talk to colleagues in education. But that basically shows that of the 4 offices, of the 4 technical sectors that I talked to, well, 3, because I represent DRG, we're all basically converts, definitely, to PEA and TWP. I don't even want to say convert, because we never did not believe in it in the first place. But we're basically adherents to the principles of PEAs and TWP. but no, I can't give you a percentage per se. I mean, of the 140, a subset of that are technical officers, and of the number
Right.
of technical officers, 7.
But it sounds like you said that it's rooted in the culture now in the mission, which is
I
great to
believe
hear.
so. I honestly believe so.
So let me merge a couple of questions that are showing up in the Q&A. So there was one astute sort of observation, is that sometimes it probably comes from the implementer perspective, that they see PEA and TWP as a donor requirement, and end up having a PEA that's a document that may not be well used. And sort of related to that is the question of, at the leadership level, do you still need to, is there work to be done to convince that leadership team about the importance and value of PEA, or are they part of your culture now?
By leadership, do you mean agency leadership
No,
overall?
the mission.
Mission
mission.
leadership.
Yeah.
I think that at that level, there's not there's no resistance to doing this. However, just to sort of ground us into just to sort of express our own reality in the mission. Working and politically, especially when you're looking at institutional reform, when you're looking at economic policy reform, could get us into trouble. And that's the reality. When you try to do economic policy reform, you are basically creating a line between gainers and losers. When you're fighting against a monopoly and you're trying to liberalize a particular sector in the economy, be it the airline industry in our case, or telecommunications, you are stepping on very big toes. And sometimes it does get us into trouble. And I think that's where some of the hesitation is. Do you really think we should? Is there, what are the political risks? Are some of the questions that I get asked. In one particular instance, a superior officer at AID basically said to me, "Don't be the person that gets me thrown out of the country," quote unquote. He shall be forever unnamed. But the point being, I think that it is not so much the lack of faith in the theory, in the methodology, but it's really more an assessment of political risk and whether it will make, we had a Duterte administration in the last 6 years that was very, very allergic to criticism, that was very, very allergic to what was perceived as foreign intervention. And so that, I think, was where a lot of the resistance was coming from. Not really resistance, but reservation, the stepping back, and let's consider this for a moment before we, go headlong into a particular development endeavor. Did I think I missed the first part of your question.
Yeah, sometimes doing a PEA is just sort of a check the box, a donor requirement. You do it, you write a report. How do you at the mission get around it just being a check the box exercise?
Actually, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you look at ADS 200 and the whole program cycle process, I don't think conducting PEA is a requirement. And I may be wrong about that. I'm not a program officer.
I think this person is particularly talking about like in a contract or an agreement, you're required to do in month 3 or 4 a PEA.
But my answer, I guess, is irrelevant to that. If it is not a checking the box exercise because we're not required anyway. We do require it because we do see the need for that. In many of the scopes of work and program descriptions that I have written, I specifically asked for political economy analysis. And as a responsible project officer, the old term for AORs, I would sit down with the implementing partners and we would really go through 2 days, 3 days of brainstorming to apply, to basically have consensus on what we've learned and then have consensus on what we need to apply. But I'm in a position where I'm only speaking for myself, but I do believe that it is much more than a check the box exercise in USAID Philippines, at least.
Okay, that's great to hear. There was a very astute question is that in the UK, in some instances, they use the skill set of PEA and thinking and working politically as a factor for promotion. Is there any perspective that way in USAID now that team members that are using this approach and informing the programming this way and making, helping to make realistic perspectives and actions in the programming? Is this being used as a criteria for advancement?
It's a very interesting question and kind of gives me food for thought as I write my own work objectives because we're entering the next cycle. I think it is more implicit than it is explicit. In our personal evaluation process, I am graded. Part of my points come from my project design engagement. And there is consideration about how effective the designs are, et cetera, but it's not explicit. I do not have applying PEA and thinking and working politically as a work objective per se, but that's an interesting idea.
Okay. Well, one of the questions may encourage more change. So I think we're headed up close to the end of your time, but there was an earlier question, and I'm going to try to put them together. You know, the concept of going with or against the grain. This has been, in fact, there's a book using that terminology. And wanted to hear your thoughts on how gender and PEA work together, especially where key stakeholders may either be a part of a system that marginalizes women's voices.
That's a really interesting question, and one that we tackled just a year ago or a couple of years ago. I designed a program that was essentially a human rights program in disguise under the Duterte administration. And basically, in order to have plausible deniability, to use that phrase, I basically called it an access to justice program. The unspoken phrase there was so that people could demand and assert their rights. You know, the previous administration was very, very skittish about criticisms related to the human rights record, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things we did was we convened focus group discussions around the country to look at which vulnerable sectors have the least access to justice, ergo the least access to enforcing their rights. And one of the groups that we came across that basically came out as number one in most of our focus discussions are indigenous peoples in the Philippines, of which there are more than 100 distinct ethno-linguistic groups. And when we did the political economy analysis for that, we did so political economy analysis can be implemented at the country level, at the sector level, or at the level of the specific subsector or problem. So in this case, we did a political economy analysis of the barriers, the constraints of indigenous peoples in terms of accessing justice. And one of the things we really tried to focus on was to look at whether women and men who belong to indigenous communities have significant differences in terms of their access to justice. And we did find out stark differences between the gender groups in relation to access to justice, challenges, access, etc. I could go on and on, but essentially the answer to that question is it's something that we are aware of, concerned about, and in my case, something that I looked at very, very recently.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, there is a methodology, and I think it was CARE International that, at least the first methodology I saw, that combined PEA and GESI analysis. And at RTI, we've done the same based on that initial methodology. So maybe Catherine, if you can look and see if you could find it and put it in the chat. It's CARE International and PEA and gender analysis. Something like that in the title. I think there's a couple of questions about this topic in the Q&A. So let's move on. We're going to move to, thank you so much, Jerry. Great insights at the mission level. We're going to move next to implementing partners. So joining us is Wilf Mwamba, he's Chief of Party for DAI in Zambia, and Maria Ines Velasco, Director of Regional Coordination at Comonix, Mexico. They're going to share their lessons learned and their insights into implementing PEAs at the project level and how they've sort of helped encourage their teams to shift into thinking and working politically. And there's been a few questions in the Q&A as what do we mean by how do we shift into TWP? So if maybe you could capture that as you speak. You know, sometimes that terminology is used interchangeably, but what's the difference and how do you shift into thinking and working politically? So let me throw out the first question. How have both of you used PEA to inform and support that shift into thinking and working politically? So,
well, I can
Maria,
start.
great.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, before stepping in fully into the question, I just want to frame the program in which I collaborate. So PREVI, or the Violence Prevention and Reduction Program, main objective is to strengthen the capacity of municipal governments and communities to effectively resolve and mitigate local crime and violence by shifting the focus away from punitive justice to preventive and proactive justice. So this is a 4-year program, and at this moment we are in our 3rd year of implementation. But it's important to share this because at the end we understand social violence and crime as a problem with a high complexity. So a tool like PEA has to do at the end with understanding some of this complexity of this social phenomena of crime and violence. So in this program, and from a TWP approach, the use of resources such as PEA allows development programs such as PREVI to facilitate an understanding of the political and social dynamics that permeate the actions, behaviors, and decision-makings of local actors and sector. At the end, all of these impact the implementation and the work of USAID programs at a local level. So, taking this into account, we have twice implemented PEAs exercises. The first exercise was a pilot and was carried out in most of the regions that PREVI implements their activities, 5 regions around Mexico. And the central focus of this first exercise was to obtain information for programmatic decision-making in the face of electoral elections in 2019. As Jerry already mentioned, they want to run also an exercise that is related to electoral elections. So we faced this in 2019, and the idea was to dig into the political context with the aim of reinforcing the work that we already done, and also improving the implementation of the program strategies due to political changes as a result of the election results, no? For this first experience, we include a specific section of gender and social inclusion. No, the GESI, we include a specific section of GESI, and the information at the end was of great interest of the mission in Mexico, specific the GESI part that we work. Since it was our first PEA, it was more of a practice of knowledge and training of the team in this type of analysis. It took us a long time to carry out. In the end, it was a good first exercise that allowed us as an implementing team to incorporate new lenses to analyze the different contexts in which the program is implemented. That was our first experience integrating PEA as a thinking and working politically strategy. The second exercise was a rapid PA. And with rapid, I mean, we want to carry out in a short period of time, a PA exercise in order to make programmatic decisions for the implementations of a particular objective of the program. The challenge that we wanted to address with this exercise has to do with a multiplicity of actors with different visions and level of decision makings with whom PREVI must interact and generate agreements. No, so at a local level, you have to generate agreements maybe with the prosecutor office, but also you have to create agreements with the head of the state of security policies. And there's a lot of power in this kind of relation. So we need to understand what kind of power, what kind of relationships were at the local level. So another challenge was the complex power relationships between key actors, local actors, social actors with a high degree of political influence, and a really high politicized context. And a third challenge was that tactical local actors were showing some resistance to collaborating with previous strategy. So from the challenge, we decided to run this rapid PEA exercise. So we plan to do this exercise of a month or half of a month work, contemplating the preparation of the study, the interviews, and the final analysis. But at the end, the entire exercise took us like 3 months. So the thing of time consuming was, it is for us an actual challenge.
Right, it's always a balancing act, right, Maria?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to shift to Wilf if you want to give your perspectives on using PEA to inform and support TWP.
Sure, thanks. So our project is a decentralization project, and the first PEA we used was in inception, which was done by external consultants. And I think part of the challenge we found was this focus on the report itself. So to start building a culture of TWP, we revised that initial baseline PEA, as we call it, to make sure, and the methodology to ensure that it was useful for us in a practical way. So now in the project, we do this quarterly, tracking macro factors. For example, the centralization of power and authority, why is that, and where do we see the actors that want to hold on to power? At the same time, at the subnational levels, we do the macro, we look at the macro factors like, shakers and movers, blockers, and how we engage with those.
And so would you say that this, after doing the baseline during the inception period, tell us a little bit more about your quarterlies. How rigorous are they? How many people do you talk to? Do you feel like that's one step toward thinking and working politically within the project? Will, sorry, you're a bit frozen. Maybe you could go off camera. Well, let me shift to, go ahead.
Sometimes we can be the enemies of our own. The tools have gotten better, but some get there. So we do a rigorous with the base of the guidelines that are laid down. Over time, in adapting that, we still follow that, but it's more important to know where things are moving. So rather than seek to be perfect, we track those areas that we know have much more significance to what we do, and so we can do that as a matter of course. We do that, you know, when I'm meeting a senior government official, I want to learn what they think, what impact they will have on that particular factor. And my team in the field does that as well. So we kind of just encourage this as a matter of fact, rather than a matter of practice, rather than, you know, carrying around the questionnaire and answering it as vigorously as you would probably expect.
Yeah, that's a great example where you're just incorporating this kind of questioning into other activities you're doing, other discussions you're having with either your counterparts or your project team. Really great example of shifting into thinking and working politically. Maria, do you want to, what results have you seen from the, you talked about two different types of PEA. One is much more of a comprehensive one and then a rapid one. What were some of the exact results from that work?
Well, some of the significant results for both exercises. For the first one, we have the opportunity to have like this prospective vision of different scenarios. So, for example, if a candidate A wins, what we should do, compare if a candidate B wins, what we should do, what is the agenda for both candidates, and what was the track that we should follow depending on the candidate, on the winning candidate. We also confirmed that previous agendas was of interest, and in some cases was a priority within the candidates' political agendas, so that was a good thing for us. We also had the opportunity to identify through the interviews new stakeholders that previously were unknown to PREVI. So the exercise allowed us to identify fresh and relevant actors and pertinent networks for programming and for the work that was that we were doing at that precise moment. So the applied PA exercise was also critical for a comprehensive understanding of local partitions politics positionings around vulnerable population and topics, particularly the LGBTQ community and also the women's agenda. So the exercise provide us in a very clarity way to PREVI and, well, actually to a GESI political agenda. We also identify new access points to the systems and institutions that were resistant to change or collaboration with the USAID program. And we also had, yeah.
I'm just going to push you, Maria. Yeah. So these are great sort of interim results. What difference did it make that you had new stakeholders? What difference did it make that you understood the local politics around vulnerable populations? What difference did it make that you had scenarios based on if candidate A wins or candidate B wins? For the project, what specifically helped? What changed in the project as a result?
Well, it helped us. At the end, it is important to share that the implementing team, this is our second program that we are implementing. We had a previous program. So the local actors that we already had, that we already have like a strong relationship, no, there wasn't enough for us. So when we run these exercises and we open our spectrum of local actors. So it was really important to get new actors because that was a new opportunity for us to perform new actions and new ideas at a local level.
Okay, great. New ideas and actions that the project took on as a result of expanding your stakeholders.
Yeah, also innovation, it was a new opportunity for us.
Great, really interesting insights. Wilf, I'm going to shift to you with the next question. So tell us, what have you experienced in terms of barriers and opportunities as you implement an activity to be able to really integrate this into ongoing activities? It sounds like you have sort of a quarterly, check or list of things you look at, and I'm assuming you also report on to USAID. So what kind of barriers and opportunities have you run up against in that process?
Sure. I mean, I think because of the tools and the fact that we've made this a culture, I think we're able to identify better the when to go with the grain and when to seek to change the grain. To give you an example, when the we have a new government that came in just over a year ago, they came in and pushed a lot of money to what is called the Constituency Development Fund. Now, this is a fund that goes to a local authority, but is really not controlled by the local authority. If we're purists, we would say, hey, that's not decentralization because you're taking money away from the local authority. But knowing that this is where the political will is, we're using that as an entry point to show how things can change where there's will for the government to implement something that they believe will make a difference to the people. And with the barriers that we're finding from there, we're able to influence policy at a wider scale, because the laws, for example, for procurement are the same, whether you use that fund or the normal local authority funds. And so where the barrier is that all decisions have to be made at the center, it will be the same across any of the other pieces of decentralization. So those are things that we're able to recognize. We're able to see that bureaucratic will is actually a bigger barrier than political will, and sometimes that's not as easy to spot. We all talk about political will, but what do you do when it's bureaucratic will? That's more of a problem, and I think that's. Those are some of the changes that are really tangible that we've been able to see. And I think it's helped us also to recognize that focusing on the outcome can sometimes be much more important than the perfect technical way of doing it. Sometimes it may not be perfect, but if it's delivering, ultimately, what do we want? We want development. We want people to be engaged in decision making. And if the route to that doesn't match to how we were designed and the institutions we were meant to build, we sometimes have to start at the end and start building institutions in reverse.
Yeah, great insight. I really like this idea of the bureaucratic barriers and wills. Do you see that at all levels? Do you see that within your organization, with your counterparts? Do you see it within the mission to some extent too?
Sure, yes. Actually, that's I do. And I think in terms of some of the barriers to the utilization of PEA across all those, I mean, when I look at my own institution and look at USAID, sometimes we can focus on the report. So, I have a copy editor. I'm not a native English speaker. So rather than focus on getting you the perfect report, I get a copy editor to help me. But the substance that we can bring to that is much more important. And I think that's important. In order for us to really make this useful, we've got to know what really is important. And there are also some operational barriers, right? Because if you don't think TWP across the organization, your procurement may not support it. We've had opportunities which we've missed because perhaps we hadn't thought well enough about the procurement that we needed in order to move at a time when the timing was right. And then there's also sometimes a rigidity in the way we either design or interpret our own contracts, and vice versa for how USAID interpret that. So when you get into the contract says, and sometimes, to be honest, it's a bit of laziness on both sides, then we end up not being able to fully maximize the use of TWP.
Good insight. I have a follow-up question for you later, but I wanted to turn to Maria. And excuse me. Has in your project, has this emphasis on PEA and TWP changed the way and who you recruit in terms of staffing?
Well, yes, I think I've been seeing these changes in the way the program outsources some activities. So in the contract and donations that Previ carries out to implement more specific actions at a local levels, we had put more emphasis in the integration of these new methodologies into the technical proposals that are presented by a third party. So for example, we are currently working on the use of PDIA components within a problem-oriented policy strategy, but we are not applying those, the PDIA in a direct way. So we are doing with a third party. So yeah, we are trying to get partners that knows these tools and had the ability to implement it in the communities.
Okay.
And another thing, these changes not only occur when we are hiring other teams, but we also observe that at the level of team development, we also seen changes there. So previous team learn how to ask questions that matter through a political economic lenses. So we also have the opportunity to see changes at this level.
Okay, so it sounds like it's influenced maybe some of the partners that you bring on board, but you're investing a lot in the staff and having them learn the methodology and be able to carry it on moving forward. And just so for everybody listening, PDIA is problem-driven iterative adaptation. It's a form of PEA, it's problem-based, and you take the results and you adapt your programming in response to it. You can find a methodology online. It is in essence similar to what USAID recommends, but I think it's just a little bit more intentional, I think, on the adaptation side of the equation. So, Wilf, the question I wanted to ask you is, and this came in as also a question in the previous session, about what's been your experience with your counterparts at USAID, particularly in your case, it would be a COR, right? And the CO's office in the mission. Have they been flexible in the adaptation that comes out of the PEA and thinking and working politically in your project? Have you been able to adapt activities easily, or maybe even adapt your work plan without a lot of paper or without a long stretch of time in paperwork?
Sure. We've been very lucky. I think from design, the team from USAID that designed the project gave us flexibility. But to give you an example of how the mission itself has received some of the PEA, we're in the process of changing our Section C, our contract, based on the findings. Our original contract, for example, had targets that in discussion we've found those targets will not apply. And so what the mission has, been great at is realizing that, and we're removing those targets from the contract, keeping the key objectives and keeping the outcomes, but giving us much more flexibility in how we get that. So we may be in a position that's enviable by most, but we've had a very good relationship with the mission.
That's great that you've been able to change your targets, change your contract as a result of the PEA. What difference has that made to the project, or is it still a work in progress?
It's still a work in progress. We're just entering our year 3, but what I can tell you, given what we've done over the last 2 years, I look at year 3 and I'm excited because we can accelerate, and that's been enabled by the fact that we've created an environment of trust with the mission. They can see that we're getting results. When we came into this as a program, there was another partner who's been there for a longer time, and yet now we're kind of seen as one of instead of being the new boy on the block, we're a partner of choice to many of our counterparts, and that's a good thing, I think.
Really great perspective. I'm going to try to start to pull out some of the questions in the Q&A. Maria, did you want to talk about what's been your experience with your mission counterparts? I'm assuming it's a contract, so your COR, and then the corresponding CO's office. Have they been open to adapting the work plan, adapting your activities in response to the PEA results?
Yeah, I think we had impact the mission perspective. I think PA it's a great tool to transmit information and spot some challenges closer to the mission team. And when you work like in different regions, so the context is so complex, a tool like this permits to gather information and to transmit this information to the mission in front of some questions like why this is working in this place and is not working in this other place, or why we should stop working in this municipality because the political context is not a good one to implement the program. So yes, for sure we had impact the vision of the mission about the implementing of the program. Yes.
I have a follow-up related question from the Q&A from Sylvia Bitter. She has a really insightful question about we're working with a lot of governments and a lot of contexts where the civic space and freedom of information, speech and rights are shrinking. And how you just mentioned that you deal with different areas differently based on the results from the PEA. So how have you encouraged your staff to use this information from PEAs, but also protect them if the environment's a little bit challenging, so that, for themselves personally and their own safety?
So, so when we conducted the interviews in the first PEA, many of the social actors were like really reserved about the information they gave us, no? So an advantage for us was that we have regional teams. We had people that live and are from that particular municipality. So they had the opportunity to have other channels or ways of approaching local actors. Sometimes these are not formal spaces. So it's not it's not formal spaces. Give us the opportunity to get that information that local actors do not do in a formal space, do not give you in a formal space. So yeah, for us to have this part of the team that are part of the communities, it was an advantage for us.
Right, great point. In those local relationships themselves is what I hear you saying is a form of protection if things get a little sensitive. So I'm going to turn to Wilt. You've got a specific question from Mogus Ngumlebe. So sorry, Moses, if I didn't pronounce your last name correctly. What kind of attitudes and ways of doing things do you really push forward with your team? And between those quarterly PEA and TWP reflection, what goes on in between to result in those reflections?
Sure, thanks. I mean, as I said, we've really integrated this into the way we do business. So our structures are that I have provincial managers in the subnational areas that we work, and these people build relationships. They know the areas, so we're not talking about, we don't wait until the end of the quarter to do this. You know, with support from our home office, we have a tracking tool that we can, it's almost keeping a diary, if you like. As they meet these people, they keep improving their knowledge. We do the same at headquarters, speaking to government officials. We've learned that every time you make it too formal, you end up with people telling you what they think you want to hear. Therefore, most of this is done as a matter of course in our meetings. Whenever I'm meeting someone in government, including meeting someone in donors or having a cocktail, all those are possible places to get insights. And I think sometimes we can also forget that most of this, the information we need, it can be in the public domain, but it's not organized. A newspaper article, they don't aim to write a political economy analysis, right? But you will start to know which journalists and which authors are consistently writing about things that if you organize that knowledge, you actually have a lot that's coming out of that. So I think for us, it's really in between. We're always talking about this. So we have a project team, management team meeting on every Monday, and we're asking, is there anything in your environment that has changed that we need to know? Are there actors that have come in? Do we know anything about this person? And if we don't, can we find out more?
Great point. So you talked about, keeping an eye on the public domain. What's being said in the media? What are the key messages? Every Monday, asking questions about what's changed in the domain. What do we need to better understand? And as you mentioned earlier on, just asking these questions as a ongoing process of your work so that you get really straightforward answers rather than a separate assessment where, like you said, people tell you what they think you want to hear rather than giving you insights into your programming. There's one question, and I'll ask it to both of you, but it might be more relevant for you, Wilf. Have you, when you changed your contract, did you also reshape your objectives because they really made once you had better insights through the PEA process, or was it really more the activities that shifted?
Sure. No, as I said, I think we were lucky in the way our project was designed, so the objectives remain relevant. I mean, they're quite broad. One of our objectives, to give an example, is around the engagement of citizens, right, in processes. How we do that will change over time. Initially in our contract, we had a very almost stipulated way of doing that, which has now been removed. Our second objective is around building the capacity of local authorities so that they are able to deliver services. So I think the insight of or the foresight rather of the people who developed the project has helped us, and I think that's credit to USAID. They looked at this, and even within the contract itself, they just didn't talk about us doing political economy analysis. They wanted us to make it working politically. And in their design, I think they had taken that into account. So we've been lucky, as I said, in that, and we probably are one of those projects that can be grateful to the last 10 years of USAID using political economy analysis and applying it, that we were designed this way.
Yeah, great insight. I do know, just to add a little bit to that, is that there have been instances as a result of a PEA where an additional objective is added because insights came up in a particular project that we've implemented where it just needed stronger focus on the national level engagement that wasn't originally in the design. So sometimes it's an addition of an objective if the PEA results warrant it. So that's another perspective. Maria, how about you? Have you adjusted your project objectives as a result of the PEA insights and thinking and working politically?
Well, not at objective level, but I think that the PEA must be matched with the flexibility to carry out changes in the program's implementation, and also in the vision and expectation of USAID mission team. So I think we impact in this level the vision of the mission, no, the expectations. So not we didn't change the objectives, but we for sure we question the first assumptions, and we get new assumptions.
You incorporated new assumptions into the way you operated.
Yeah.
Great. So Wilfred, I have one other question for you. We just have a couple minutes left on your session. Dederai had a really interesting question about the Constituency Development Fund. And I think these money arrangements between national government and local government are always fraught with politics and relationships and other issues, and was interested about how you dealt with the politics around that funding, because it's raised at the local government level. It goes assumed to the central, and maybe not going back as much as what is envisioned in the fundraising. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the constituent fund, and then what that meant and how you shifted things in your project as a result?
Sure. So this is still work in progress, and actually it's the opposite. So this is a fund that central government provides for constituency development. So the central government, until a year ago, this was like $90,000. It's now grown to $1.6 million, and growing to almost $2 million next financial year. So this money, ideally, we would have loved this money to go into what we have constitutionally called the Local Government Equalization Fund, that looks at this money and provides it as the gap between what a local authority can raise and what it needs. However, the government decided on doing this because that's what they understood from their promises, and wanting to make sure that the money gets to the communities. So it achieves the fact that the aim of getting money to the communities, but its administration is still very centralized. So a minister at the center has to sign off on a project that's been, decided 1,000 kilometers away. And so what we've done to start supporting that is providing evidence to them on where these blockages are, and that's beginning to inform how they revise the law, how they revise the guidelines. And we started off saying this doesn't work, but that wasn't going to go anywhere. And we decided, let's help them make it work. But every opportunity we find where there's a blockage, we say this blockage is on CDF, but actually it's a blockage across, the local government and local governance situation as a whole. Hopefully that helps.
Really interesting. So really taking that topic and using thinking and working politically as you implement. That's a really great example. Thank you, Maria. Really great perspectives from the implementing partner arena. We're going to shift now to the last session. Sarah Swift's going to help us have a better understanding of the DRG Center and how the perspectives on USAID policy and guidance about PEA has shifted, and what she can share about what some future changes that may be in the works. So Sarah, thanks for joining us. Sarah's a DRG specialist in the DRG Center, and she too has been involved in the PEA methodology, refining it, adapting it, and improving it over probably almost the same amount of time as Laura. So welcome, Sarah. We're glad to have you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's really, I've really been excited to listen to everybody here. It's been very inspiring. So kind of in thinking about sort of the policy question, I sort of, in PA, it's always about formulating the question. And I started to think about it just a little bit differently, and kind of thinking about, okay, looking back, like, why have we seen the progress that we have? And why haven't we seen more? And certainly, policy is a part of that. If we look at sort of the transition from rigid log frames to much more flexible models of describing logic, that's really important. Looking forward, we have some big challenges around developing more flexibility in terms of what we use funding for, in terms of the timeframes of our objectives and kind of the scope of what we're looking to achieve with our programming. And we see certain, as Laura discussed, certain elements of programming that are embracing longer time horizons, like the Global Fragility Act programming, like partnerships for democratic development, other things that kind of we see in progress. I don't know that I can preview any sort of huge. We also have, a DRG policy or a strategy, I guess, or policy that is in the works, that will be kind of looking at sort of providing, providing an overall framework for thinking about how USAID programs contribute to kind of the big questions of democratic development and resilience of democratic societies overall. And I think that those are all things that will enable and support more politically informed programs. But with all of it, I also think regardless of the policy questions, so much of it has come down to informal rules and norms within our culture at all kinds of different levels. So really thinking about kind of what are the incentives that have driven the behavior, the behaviors of mission staff and implementers, and what can we do to shift those things to really enable more programming, that more politically informed programming. So, some of the challenges are short terms of our, American staff overseas, power structures and the need, as Laura said, to enable and empower local staff in order to kind of build these longer term horizons. And then also, strong incentives around achieving measurable concrete results within a short time frame. And those are things that we really need to, that we need to be working on. A final kind of incentive, I think, is just the desire to, avoid a disaster. Or if you're going to have a disaster, to fail in a way that many people have failed before. So that you're not, I think that it seems much riskier to be failing doing something new than it is to kind of be going over well-trodden paths and still fail, while you're in good company. So really kind of thinking about how do we make TWP feel like a well-trodden path, feel like something that's familiar, that is safe. And so I think looking at our role as really trying to amplify these experiences, listening to the conversation to date, I'm humbled, as I always am, about sort of how much we miss within a decentralized agency, and how important it is that we do more to collect the experiences of our missions. Jerry's amazing range of experiences over decades, and the work in the Philippines. Maria Inez and Will also have programmings and practices that I know that we could learn so much about, and so please don't be surprised if I'm following up. And so anyway, I did kind of want to sort of put out an appeal that I hope that this will be a partnership going forward. And even, to the extent that people want to put in the chat, programs, examples of work that you think would be helpful as we amplify. We're looking at different kinds of learning models, continuing a lot of training, but also looking at perhaps developing podcasts or more blogs or things that really sort of take some of the stories of different experiences that we have in missions and make those more available. One final thing, just kind of responding to the, some comments around sort of working with the grain or changing the grain. I'd like to suggest maybe, it's always that we should always be looking to work with the grain, but that we shouldn't assume that there's a single grain. That, we're looking at tapping into currents that happen within societies. Some of those currents, have, if we're looking at things being sustainable, we have to have that. It isn't an option to just go in and fight all the grains that are happening within a society if we want, to have a sustainable impact. But sometimes we do need to work at cultivating and bringing together coalitions that may have a longer term horizon. And so thinking about it in terms of, yes, looking at things with a little bit more imagination, being a bit more transformational, and thinking about how we might begin to tap into less obvious sources of power within a context.
Great, thanks for that insight. I have a follow-up question. In the new DRG strategy, is there a strong, or is there an emphasis on PEA and thinking and working politically? Will we see that appear?
Yes, I mean, I don't have a concrete preview, but yes, we will look at that. We're looking more at, kind of different elements of it about sort of, I know that we are looking at kind of how the impacts of different programs interact, about how work that we're doing in a health or an education sector ultimately impacts our efforts to support healthy democratic governance. And that's very much kind of understanding how different factors interact, what those incentives are that are shifting. So I'm not sure I can share exactly what that will look like, but I'm confident that it will be in there.
Great, sure. We know it's very much a work in progress, so that's great to hear. We also, I think, have seen quite a few new policies coming out of the agency. Quite a number of coming from DRG, the anti-corruption work, the localization policy. Have you seen a lens of PEA and TWP embedded inside each of those new policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, I think, I think the localization is really inextricable, and obviously David Jacobstein who has been key to both the thinking and working politically efforts and to the localization efforts in the policy. I think understanding kind of local power dynamics is really inextricable from our work on thinking and working politically. And certainly also you see that with anti-corruption as well, that understanding how anti-corruption, how embedded it is in a political economy, a local political economy, and what impacts may be. I know what impacts may exist from work, from anti-corruption efforts, I think is really key. And you do see that embraced. And I think there's more to come as we, work more closely on implementation in the future.
Sorry about that. There were a number of questions in the Q&A, Sarah, throughout the conversation about a methodology for conducting PEA. And then is there any methodology that really sort of guides implementers and USAID staff on shifting to thinking and working politically? So any insights in the agency about the methodology for both of those?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we do have, we do have a guide, which includes sort of, both broad principles and kind of step-by-step on implementation. But yes, basically on that initial, mostly focused on that initial baseline of, sort of how do you kind of deepen your understanding of a context. And there's more work to be done on shifting into more flexible approaches and more sort of embedded approaches. Some of the things that we have we have a collection of tools and tips on Learning Lab, which is an external facing website that we have. And have a number of sort of discrete tools about a range of, one is on, formal to informal approaches to learning, about how to build this into context monitoring, and look at, or different ways of thinking about the evolving political economy as you go forward. Things about, for mission staff on moving things into solicitations. And I think that there's more that we could do to provide sort of guidance and really think about, looking at the experience of our partners of, how do we craft things at the solicitation phase that will ultimately set up the programming for, greater degree of success. So I think, we have a number of tools. I think that it's something that we could probably do a lot more of, and I would really welcome people also to be in touch with suggestions of the kinds of resources that we might develop and promote.
Yeah, great idea, Sarah. If you don't mind, as we shift to Alina's sort of wrap up, could you put a link to that Learning Lab? I know there's a lot of resources in the Learning Lab about PEA and thinking and working politically. That'd be great.
Sure.
Thanks very much for your insight. Really appreciate it. So we're going to shift now to Alina. She's going to she's been listening intently, I can tell, throughout today and the session, and sort of pull out the areas that really struck her and how we can all work together to encourage the growth and effectiveness of PEA and TWP, whether we're with USAID in Washington, in a mission, an implementing partner, or all of the above. So Alina, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks very much. Great to see you again.
No, really, thank you, Lisa. It has been so wonderful to be part of this panel, reflecting on USAID's and implementing partners' experience with PEA and TWP over the past decade. And in a way, because I feel like I have been, at least in part, I have been part of this journey. As I was working with USAID as a senior democracy fellow on PEA and TWP between 2016 and 2019. And it really is wonderful to see how far this agenda has gone within USAID and with implementing partners. Laura mentioned the importance of the work of the DRG Center over the years in helping to instill and socialize TWP and provide support on PEA across USAID. And also now Sarah has been mentioning the kind of guidance that has been provided across time and place from USAID. And I could not agree more with both of them. And of course, I may be biased about this, but I can say from my experience working with colleagues like Sarah, like Lisa, on this panel, as well as with others, how very important not only available guidance on paper, but especially trainings have been to enable USAID staff and partners to embrace PEA and embed it as a lens in their work. I was very encouraged by Laura's reflections on how much traction PEA and TWP have gotten within USAID at the policy and strategic level, and how lasting that impact has proven in terms of highlighting the centrality of politics to development and in internalizing the implications of that for ways of working, both at different levels of engagement from the local to the global, and also in terms of the sectors and regions that have made sustained efforts to take politics into account over the past decade. Sarah also has laid out important strategic processes that are intended to further institutionalize TWP within USAID in terms of, for example, support to democracy, efforts to combat corruption more effectively over both the short and the longer term. And we very much look forward to see what that looks like. And I'm also profoundly grateful for this webinar because it has helped to bring to life what efforts to apply PA look like across very different countries and settings. So I have been very heartened to hear from people like Jerry in the Philippines, Maria Inés on Mexico, and Wilf on Zambia. And I feel like there's quite a bit of optimism in terms of PA and TWP in helping to understand settings and issues that USAID and partners work on in all of their complexity, and to inform and shape plans and strategies for engagement, including, for example, in terms of using political economy analysis explicitly to identify reform champions and build alliances for change, including beyond looking at to the usual suspects, while also being mindful and smart about what or really who are the big forces against change and how to navigate that. The use of PA has been really important in understanding and unpacking whether there may be a political will or not, and why. And I really liked how Wilf put it in terms of bureaucratic constraints to change and a bureaucratic will, and you know, how you disaggregate that and understand it better to identify entry points for being able to bring about change. And much of what everyone has said here helps to reinforce important messages and lessons that have emerged across the field more broadly. And I think chief among them is that to date, there seems still to be a lot of progress, considerable progress on the thinking part of TWP, while the working part remains more of an enduring or elusive challenge, although again, we have now heard the perspectives from Zambia, the Philippines, and Mexico to help anchor a little bit of what that looks like in practice. I think it's really important here to emphasize a point that Jerry made about the use of PA and TWP terminology, because that may be more or less familiar to different people, but the substance of it, the need to think in more politically aware ways and to tease out implications for ways of working, really goes back much further than the past 10 years. And at least some people, including in the Philippines, for example, have been thinking and working in these ways for a very long time, even if they don't call it that. So I think it's really important to recognize that the terminology itself should not be reified, and that there are a lot of people who are constantly thinking about politics in ways that may not be branding like this, but that are still very important to recognize. There have also been important efforts, as we heard from Maria Inés and Wilf, to seek to institutionalize the use of political economy analysis across programs, so that PA does not become a one-off piece of analysis, but there is ongoing tracking of issues. In this way, political economy analysis can become more of a lens to understand where things are shifting and why, and an angle or a perspective that can be incorporated into ongoing work without having to become some kind of elaborate analytical exercise. But still, some challenges remain, and we heard a few things on that front. I really like the emphasis that I heard across different speakers about the importance of recognizing that political economy analysis, and in particular TWP, can be quite resource intensive. It takes a lot of time to understand the context, to build relationships, etc. So this needs to be seen as an actual investment, especially in terms of investing in local staff. And I think this is a point that came across very vividly across everybody. Funding and procurement models can also impose constraints. For example, if funding is unpredictable, and now we have the lovely example of the United Kingdom for that, but if funding is unpredictable or cannot provide longer-term visibility, this makes embracing TWP principles around, for example, testing and experimentation quite difficult. There's also a challenge when funding is highly prescriptive, because it makes programs less flexible and responsive to contextual realities. So there can be issues related to rigidity in design and the implementation of contracts. And I also liked what Wilf said here in terms of a default position that reflects, quote, a laziness from both sides that limits potential for TWP. And you can see how this can shift if there is more openness and trust between USAID and implementing partners that is captured, for example, in more open objectives or in refined assumptions about how change happens in the measure that assumptions are proven to be limited. And this all enables greater experimentation and accuracy. I also very much like the point that Sarah made about how informal norms and practices may persist and what this means in terms of ensuring that USAID in particular builds an environment, not only formally, but especially informally, to make working in TWP anchored ways feel safe. So creating the incentives for USAID staff and implementing partners to work in this way and think about this as a collaborative journey that is a partnership among all stakeholders. Briefly before closing, I also wanted to flag that Chemonics is having a very exciting symposium next week, I believe, 15 and 16 December, on thinking and working politically, learning and futures. And Catherine will hopefully help me put the link to the event on the chat here so that all of you who are interested in attending can sign up. I can assure you that it's going to be a really fascinating conversation that hopefully will be building on a lot of what we have said today. And I also, before giving the floor back to Lisa, I wanted to thank Mark and Derek for organizing this wonderful webinar, which I thought was fantastic. And I also want to thank Lisa, of course, for so ably chairing the event today, navigating us through the proceedings. And I also want to thank every one of the speakers for joining us at very different time zones, in very different time zones that are more or less inconvenient to a lot of you. So thank you so much for your reflections and your insights. So with that, I will now turn over to Lisa. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina. Really nice wrap up where you pulled out highlights from everything. Just one observation I wanted to make is from listening to the inputs of everyone, I think the W in TWP is happening, but maybe we just haven't documented it well enough. Certainly it needs to be encouraged more, but I heard Wilf, I heard Maria talk about ways they've changed their programming as a result of doing a PEA process, but more importantly, sort of incorporating that way of thinking inside their programming. So we should maybe think about doing some sort of documentation of the W of TWP. So thank you everyone for joining. Jerry, you get the prize for staying up almost to your midnight. So thank you for joining. My thanks to the panelists. Everyone provided great insights. And for those who helped organize, Derek, Mark, Catherine, really, really helpful. I thought it was a great event. I learned a lot, and hopefully we'll get to join up again in the future. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or night, depending on where you are. Take care.